this is going to be a recurrent theme of this quiz, but I think other quizzes, is that when you use language in economics, you have to use it definitively, right? You have to use it concretely and not just kind of talk around things. And so I did notice that that was a problem with a few of your quizzes, is that it's not that I didn't think you kind of knew what you were talking about, but you had a very difficult time explaining exactly why, right? And so exactness, I think, is a principle that we're going to be trying to develop in this class, right? To use language concretely, to use language exactly. And so, you know, when you see a question like number 1 that says, why does it hold? I'm looking for a concrete, exact answer. Some of you had answers like, well, it holds because, yeah, when things get cheaper, people buy less of it. Well, that's not a why, right? I mean, you're really just explaining that the demand curve is downward sloping. You're not really explaining why, right? And so you need to be more concrete. Question number 2, explain the difference between a shift in supply and a shift in quantity supply. A shift in supply is caused by a change in something other than price, and it leads to a new supply curve. A shift in quantity supplied is caused by a change in price, and it's a movement along the supply curve. Question number 3, what's meant by a perfectly competitive market? Once again, there's a concrete answer here. A perfectly competitive market has homogeneous goods, a large number of buyers and sellers, and everybody is a price taker, right? It means those 3 things. What is true about market equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market? That quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, right? In other words, the market clears. Why do economists disagree? You know, we talked in class about 4 or 5 reasons why economists disagree. The most important, in my opinion, is the fact that we don't have controlled experiments, right? We lack the ability to have controlled experiments. We also work with people, right? Which is, you know, people are not as predictable as chemicals are. We talked about the problem of getting information in economics. We also talked about the problem of fallacy of composition in macroeconomics in particular. So I really wanted you to talk about one of those reasons, right? To just say that economists disagree because, you know, there's a lot going on in the world and nobody knows anything. Well, no, right? I mean, you have really what I was looking for in this question is what makes economics particularly difficult, right? I mean, everything that we know in this world is somewhat difficult to learn. What makes economics particularly difficult? And I would say it would be those 4 things. Okay, and then finally, here's the question about the price of coal-produced electricity. What happens in the following markets? I'm gonna switch to my iPad here. So the first question says, what happens to the market for electric cars? When the cost of coal-produced electricity goes down? Well, certainly electricity would be a complement to an electric car, right? Because you need electricity to run an electric car. So the decrease in the price of a complement should lead to an increase in demand. That's how I would answer this. Okay. Let me talk about one common mistake here. A few of you had demand shifting, but then you also had supply shifting. And unless you explain that in some way, supply should not shift, right? Now notice there's a movement along our supply curve, right? As the price rises, we move along our supply curve. But I don't see any obvious reasons here why supply would shift. A couple of you argued, well, electricity is an input into producing electric cars. Maybe, and if you explain that well, I gave you credit for it. But I think that the number one effect, or the primary effect here, is that demand should go up because electricity is a complement to using an electric car. All right, how about the next question, which is, what happens in the market for bicycles? Well, if electric transportation is going to be cheaper to use now, then that would probably mean that people would use less bicycles. That was kind of my thinking. And so I would expect this demand to go down because there's been a decrease in the price of a substitute. Meaning price would go down, quantity go down, and we'd move along our supply curve, right? We move along our supply curve. Once again, if you explained yourself well and your explanation made some sort of sense, I did accept other answers for some of these. But you have to explain yourself, right? You have to explain yourself. And then part C, what happens to the market for solar energy panels? Well, in this case, you could think about solar energy panels once again as a substitute. So this is really a decline in the price of a substitute. And so we would expect the demand for solar panels to go down. This is consistent with economists' arguments that the most effective way that you can move towards green energy is to make conventional energy more expensive, right? So economists are all for taxing coal-produced electricity, taxing gasoline usage, taxing anything that produces greenhouse gases, because that tax creates an incentive to switch to less carbon producing or less energy intensive means of energy. And so, yeah, you know, that's really the market at work. That's really the market at work. Okay, do those answers make sense to everybody? So, listen, first off, these quizzes are learning experiences first and foremost, right? I mean, obviously you want to do well on these quizzes, right? You don't want to get a 0. But on the flip side, if you don't do well on the quizzes and you do well on the exams, you'll be fine in this class, right? So you have to kind of use these quizzes as how I see them, as practice and feedback for the exams, right? And so they're really giving you some practice as to both the kind of questions that you're going to see in the exam and also what I expect in your answers, right? What I expect. And so I expect a certain level of, as I said, concreteness and using language definitely, right? As opposed to kind of using language loosely and kind of BSing, right? Which, you know, I think can happen. So use these as practice, right? Use these as practice to get ready for the exam. If you got on this first exam, you know, a 14, a 15, a 16, I actually think that's a pretty good score, right? I think that's a pretty good score, all things considered. You know, you're getting a feel for what kind of questions I ask, what I'm expecting. So, you know, if you got in that range, then you should feel pretty good, I think, about your performance. If you got below that, then, you know, it might be time to think about, well, you know, how did I prepare for this quiz? Did I look through the right things? My take on the quiz is that we actually did pretty well on the supply and demand problems. We didn't do as well on the short answers, right? And so the kind of written problems, I think, were the problems that we struggled with a little bit more. And so maybe that's something that all of us need to spend a little bit more time thinking about is, you know, the definitions and making sure that we have a clear grasp of concepts that we talk about in class. But that will come, right? That will come. So, you know, I don't want anybody to kind of overreact to this, to your grade on one quiz. You know, we'll have many other quizzes, right, and many other exams, and so, you know, this is all a process. So, does anybody have any questions about the first quiz?
Yeah. What were the conditions on number 3 again, for the perfectly competitive market?
So it has to be a homogeneous good, right? Meaning the good has to be the same. There has to be a large number of buyers and sellers. and everybody is a price taker, right? So those are the three conditions to have a perfectly competitive market. All right, who has some other questions about the quiz? So I am happy to talk with any of you about your performance. Unfortunately, I do not have time after class this morning because I have another meeting right at 11 o'clock, but I will have time after afternoon class. And so I will kind of plan on being available after noon class if you want to send me an email and set up a specific appointment, or if you just want to kind of hang out after afternoon class, I'll be around to talk with any of you about your quiz. Let me just get a little bit of feedback about using Google Forms. You know, I mean, I guess I'm willing to try to use it again for your quiz tomorrow. I haven't heard any really negative comments from any of you. I don't know, does anybody have anything they want to share with me about their experience of using Google Forms?
The only thing that was kind of annoying is when you're like typing, you can only see about like this much of it. So like to go back to like see what you were typing, that was kind of annoying. Like if you can make like the text box bigger in any way.
Were you using your phone, Autumn?
No, I was using my computer.
I think the issue you had is you labeled each question a short answer question, which is only meant to be like 10 words in Google's like world. So making it a long answer, even though they're not long answer questions, allows us to see the whole thing.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. So that would be good. Okay, I will try that. I mean, one of the tricky things about this is I can't actually see the quiz as you see it. So that was not a problem that I had when I set up the quiz, but that is good to know, right? That is good to know. I'm just looking here in the chat. Yeah, so that seems like a couple of other people. The picture submission, I don't know. Yeah, that I don't know what to do because that's going to be a problem regardless of how we do our quizzes or exams, right? Whether I'm sending you a file, an email, and you're putting things into a file or whatever, that is going to be a problem. But I think that that all of you were able to submit a picture that I could read, right? I think maybe only one of you had a bit of a problem submitting a picture. So, yeah. So, okay. Well, why don't we try it again? Like I said, we'll try it again on quiz number 2 and see how it works. I'm not so sure that I want to do this process for the exam, but for the quizzes, given that they're shorter, maybe that will make a little, make it a little bit more, make more sense.
With the picture submission, if you just don't require it, then we can upload it and then turn in the rest of our quiz at the same time. Because the problem I was having is saying I didn't have an answer in there, even though I uploaded the picture.
Upload it, you mean not to the quiz, but to the...
I clicked upload, but it said I didn't have an answer in number 5, so I couldn't submit the rest of my quiz.
Yeah, so Cody, you're the only person that had that problem, so that's why I'm confused. I'm not sure exactly why, but well, let's try it again on Tuesday. Once there's always, or Thursday, there's always the option of sending me an email. What I am trying to avoid though is having having quizzes in which you submit your quiz, then I get an email from all you, and I'm trying to match all those up and give you one score and also give you some feedback. So it's, yeah, there's no way of online grading that isn't a bit clunky, but I would like to try to figure out if we could get this to work. So let's try it again on Thursday's quiz, and if we still have these problems, Cody, if you're still having a problem emailing pictures, then we'll definitely think of some. We can always make a move to some other form of doing this. So, okay, all right. Any other comments about this or that? If not, then let's jump into what we want to do today. So today we want to go back to our discussions about GDP, right? Go back to our discussions of GDP. So let's return to chapter 7. And I'm going to begin here this morning by talking about the difference between what we call real and nominal GDP. Real and nominal GDP. This is some terminology that we will use quite a bit in this class, right? The difference between real and nominal. Before I define real and nominal, let's just kind of work an example here of calculating GDP. So let's say that we have this wonderful country, Thailandia, all right? And this place is, it's a paradise. They only produce two goods. They produce Doritos and they produce beer, right? So you, as a young economist, decide you want to go to Thailandia and you want to figure out what's the GDP of this country, all right? So you go there, you do a little bit of investigation, and you find out that the price of Doritos in Thailandia are $1, and the price of beer is $2. And you look at how many Doritos they produce, and they produce 500 units. And the quantity of beer, they produce 600 units. Okay. What is nominal GDP in this country? Well, nominal GDP is just simply the GDP that we talked about yesterday, the market value of all goods and services produced within a country over a given period of time. So who wants to help me out here? What's nominal GDP? What's the market value of all the goods and services produced within this country?
$1,700.
1,700. Yeah. I didn't hear who said that.
Preston.
Preston. Hey, Preston. How did you get 1,700?
Well, you just take 600, multiply it by 2, and then add 500.
Yeah. Right. It's $1 times 500 plus $2 times 600. 1,700. That's nominal GDP in 2019. So calculating GDP is actually a pretty simple process, right? You just get prices of everything that's produced, quantities of everything produced, multiply them by each other and add it up, right? That's in essence what GDP is. Now, let's say you go back in 2020 to Thailandia and you want to do this same experiment, right? Or you want to calculate what GDP is in 2020. However, 2020 in Thailandia, like it was in most of the world, was not a great year. Doritos have gone up in price, and so is beer. And Doritos have gone down. Quantity of Doritos produced has gone down. And the quantity of beer has also gone down. You might ask, why do people in Thailandia like Doritos so much? And it reminds me of this, I heard somebody say the other day that, when I buy an apple, sometimes I have good apples, sometimes I had bad apples, but I've never had a bad Dorito, right? That's why the people in Toddlandia are so smart with eating Doritos. So there's been a bad year in 2020 because they've had fewer Doritos to eat. And they've also had some inflation. In other words, the prices have gone up. Here's the problem, though. What happens when we calculate nominal GDP in 2020? What's nominal GDP? Well, it's 2 times 400 plus 3 times 500. It's $2,300. What happened to nominal GDP between 2019 and 2020? It went up. Nominal GDP went up despite the fact that this country is producing less. In fact, we can calculate what the growth rate of nominal GDP was between 2019 and 2020, right? To get the growth rate, you want to take GDP in 2020 minus GDP in 19 divided by GDP in 2019 times 100, right? So remember, when you calculate a growth rate, you always want to take the new observation minus the old observation and then divide by the old, right? It's new minus old divided by old. So in this case, our new GDP would be 2,300. Our old GDP would be 1,700. We divide by 1,700, multiply by 100. Nominal GDP went up by over 35%. It went up by over 35%. How can that be? How can that be? We know that the people in Toddlandia are worse off because they have fewer Doritos and less beer. How is it that nominal GDP is telling us that they're better off? What are we missing here? Yeah, Logan, what do you think we're missing?
Well, because they're paying more for all these goods, even though they're getting less, it's still getting like a, I guess, higher value kind of less.
Right. I mean, this is inflation, right? This is inflation. This country has experienced inflation. Doritos doubled in price and beer went up by 50%. So this country has experienced inflation, which makes it seem, right, that the country is producing more. When in fact, we know that if we look at the quantities, they're actually producing less. So this is the problem with using nominal data. And I've been using this word nominal, but now let me explain it. What does nominal mean? Nominal means it's measured in current prices. Or to say it another way, it is not adjusted for inflation. Measured in current prices and not adjusted for inflation. So the problem with nominal GDP is that changes in price can overwhelm the changes in quantity so that we can't exactly tell what's going on. If we're going to compare data over time, what we need to look for is a real measure, okay? And so when economists use the word real, what are we talking about? We are talking about data that's measured in constant prices. In other words, data that is adjusted for inflation. So one of the most important factors of thinking like an economist is to make this distinction between real and nominal. Because as we're going to talk about as we go along in this class, one of the most common ways that people lie to you with statistics is to not make a clear distinction between nominal and real, right? If you compare dollar figures over time, you have to compare real data, meaning data adjusted for inflation. Because if you're not, inflation could be distorting the conclusion that you come to, right? So as economists, we want to use real data. And so if we're talking about GDP, we want to be talking about a measure of real GDP. And what is real GDP? It's basically GDP, but measured using a constant set of prices. Prices from what we'll call the base year. So what we do with real GDP is we pick 1 year's set of prices and we use it every year in calculating GDP. That makes sure that inflation is not biasing our results. Okay, so let's rework this problem, but let's use 2019 as the base year. So once again, what do we mean by the base year? We're going to use 2019 prices every year, right? We're going to use 2019 prices every year, but then we're going to use current quantities every year. So what's real GDP in 2019? Well, this one is pretty easy, right? Because the base year is also the current year. So if we're using base year prices in 2019, we were already using those when we calculated nominal GDP. In other words, this is going to be the same as nominal GDP. In the base year, real GDP and nominal GDP will be the same because you're using the same set of prices. Where it's going to be different is in years outside of the base year. All right, so Easton, are you there? Easton, can you turn on your...
Yep.
Yeah, so can you help me figure out what's real GDP in 2020? Remember, we're going to want to use 2019 prices, but 2020 quantities. Okay, 2019 prices and 2020 quantities.
No, she'd have 900.
So it's going to be 1 times 400.
Yeah. Oh, and then 2 times 500. So
Right. 1,400. Remember, before we found that nominal GDP was bigger than nominal GDP in 2020 was bigger than nominal GDP in 2019. But what are we finding when we compare real GDP? That real GDP in 2020 is less than real GDP in 2019, right? This is consistent with what we were talking about, right? Or this is more consistent with what we observe. And in fact, what happens if we calculate the growth rate in real GDP between 19 and 20? Well, we take GDP in 20 minus GDP in 19 divided by GDP in 19 multiplied by 100. So this is 1,400 minus 1,700 divided by 1,700 times 100. If you break out your calculators, what you should get is negative 17.6%. And once again, this coincides or jibes with our intuition, right? That we should be finding that real GDP went down because we know that this country's worse off. We don't find that if we just compare nominal GDP because inflation biased our results. But if we look at real GDP, we find that this is a much better measure of economic progress, right? Real GDP is a much better measure of economic progress.
That website that we were looking at the other day, is that measuring nominal or real?
So, which website do you mean?
Was it BBI or something like that? I don't know what we were looking at.
Okay, so when we were looking at that,
we were looking at US. We were looking at the quarterly GDP results for the United States.
So that was measured in real GDP, right? That was real GDP measured in constant prices. So the key here is, it's okay to look at nominal GDP if you're only looking at current time, right? Like if you're only talking about 2020, it's okay to talk about nominal GDP in 2020. What you don't want to do is compare nominal GDP in 2020 to nominal GDP in 2019 or 2018 or 2017, right? In other words, you don't want to compare nominal figures across time because it's over time that inflation will bias your results, right? So, yeah, so so this is what we mean by constant prices, right? Oftentimes, sometimes newspapers will say, well, measured in constant prices, right? That what they're really talking about is real GDP. But when economists compare dollar figures over time, we always adjust for prices. We always talk about real values, right? Because we're quite aware of the fact that inflation can significantly bias your results. So, you know, just as an example of this, just look here at some different periods of time here, looking at actual nominal GDP in the US, which is on the left side, and then real GDP in the US, which is on the right side. Here we're using 2012 as the base year. So if you look at nominal GDP, you see really big increases in nominal GDP between 2005, 2012, and 2019. But some of those increases in nominal GDP are not just produced by producing more, they're created by higher prices. And so in the real GDP column, what we're doing here is now we're adjusting for inflation. We're taking inflation out of that. And so what do we see in terms of real GDP? In terms of real GDP, yes, it's gone up, but not by nearly as much as we saw before. Notice how, in terms of real GDP, if we use 2012 as the base year, it makes 2005 look better and it makes 2019 look worse, right? It's making 2005 look better because it's using $2012 instead of $2005. And it's making 2019 look worse because it's using $2012 instead of $2019, right? So $2019 are much higher than $2012, and $2012 are higher than 2005, right? Or prices, I really should say. So we can compare these three years using real GDP, but we should not compare these 3 years using nominal GDP, because that will give us a misleading value about what's going on, right? So as I said, you know, using nominal figures over time is a great way to lie. And quite honestly, this is a way that people, you know, lie to us all the time. Just to kind of think of a couple of examples. I don't know if any of you play the lottery, but, you know, sometimes you'll have the Powerball, right? And they'll say, like, you know, win $100 million in the Powerball. Let's say you win $100 million in the Powerball. Do you actually get $100 million? No, because how they structure these payouts is, if you win $100 million, what they're going to do is they're going to give you $5 million over the next 20 years, right? But the problem is $5 million 20 years from now is worth a lot less than $5 million today in terms of purchasing power. So if you win the Powerball, you can take a lump sum payment, meaning you can take all the money right now. Are they going to give you $100 million? No. What they're going to give you is something like $50 million, which shows you how much of that purchasing power gets eaten away by inflation over time. Another way that, you know, people like to lie with statistics, for those of you who are into sports, you'll see this all the time with sports salaries, right? Kind of the classic example. I know we have some baseball players on in our class, so I'll use a baseball analogy, but there's this guy that played for the New York Mets in the 1990s, Bobby Bonilla, okay? Pretty good player. Bobby Bonilla decided he wanted to make $100 million back in the 90s. And so the Mets said, sure, but we're going to spread this out over 30 years. So Bobby Bonilla has been retired for 20 years now and still gets paid about $3 million a year, or $2 million, or whatever it is. In fact, if you're a Mets fan, I don't know if any of you are a Mets fan, they actually Mets have Bobby Bonilla Day, right? Where Bobby Bonilla gets his paycheck for the year. You know, and it's crazy. It allowed Bobby Bonilla to say, hey, I made $100 million, right? But he did not make $100 million, right? If you make a lot of that money spread out over the next 40 years, you're not really making that much in real terms, right? And so, you know, these are all the ways that people can kind of mislead you. And so, you know, this is going to be a recurring theme of this course, that if, you know, one of the ways that you become a critical consumer of information is you make sure that you're looking at real data, right? Real data measured in constant prices, because if you're not, and you're following that data over time, you could be misled, right? You could be misled. Sunny asked in the chat, doesn't inflation occur over longer periods of time, 1, 2, 3 decades, or at that point we take into account other production factors as part of real GDP? Sunny, I'm not really sure I understand that question, but other than to say that, yeah, I mean, the longer time goes on, the more inflation becomes relevant, right? Because even if you have very low inflation, right? Particularly the last few years in the US, we've had 1 or 2%. So from a year-to-year basis, you don't notice it that much. But over 20 or 30 or 40 years, yes. If you have 2% inflation, that basically means that prices will double every 35 years. Okay? So yeah, over 30 or 40 years, prices will double with even a very low level of inflation. Sunny also asked, what's the cutoff point for constant prices? How far back can we consider constant prices? I mean, well, this is a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but yes, this is why we have a lot of economists, right? Because there are economists that actually spend a lot of time thinking about how we can construct price indices. And we're actually going to talk about this here in a minute, but how do we construct price indices to measure how fast inflation is, right? So that we can go back not just 5 or 10 or 15 years in the future, but we can go back hundreds of years in the future, right? So that's real GDP, that's nominal GDP. Let's switch gears here a little bit. And I want to talk a little bit about GDP as a measure of progress. Does GDP measure progress or well-being? And what I'm getting at here is maybe a little bit more of a philosophical question. If GDP goes up by 3%, can we all say that we're 3% better off? If GDP goes up by 5%, can we all say that we're 5% better off? Right? And you can probably guess the answer to that. No, right? That GDP, I'm going to make the argument that GDP is probably about as good a measure of well-being as we can get, but that does not mean that it is a perfect measure of well-being, right? That GDP, in fact, misses a lot. As we talked about yesterday, the focus of GDP is on production. But what GDP tends to miss are things that impact well-being outside of production. So from your readings, let me ask you, what are some of the things that GDP essentially misses or doesn't explicitly include that might impact our well-being? Right? Things that might impact our well-being but don't show up in GDP. Any ideas? Faith says employment. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Now, we do have other measures of employment. In fact, we're going to talk about those here in chapter 8. It's true, it doesn't include employment. Someone's health, yes, certainly, right? Yeah, doesn't include health. Strangely enough, I'll write that down. Think about this. Surprisingly enough, poor health actually increases GDP. And you might say, why? Because what happens when you're sick? You go to the hospital, which requires the production of goods and services, right? You spend money, right? Strangely enough, poor health might actually increase GDP. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're better off, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're better off. One thing that many people have criticized GDP for, and we actually talked about this a little bit yesterday. I think, Sonny, you asked a question about this. GDP does not include household production. Meaning anything that's basically produced in the house is not included in GDP. This, oftentimes by economists, this is known as the informal economy, right? The informal economy, where you grow your own vegetables, you watch your kids, you clean your own house, maybe you watch your neighbor's kids, and they watch yours. All right, the economy that takes place, but not within formal markets. Almost all of this gets ignored in GDP. In fact, one of the reasons why GDP has risen since 1950 is the fact that so many people, so many women have moved from working in the house to working in the market, right? So, you think about the movement of women entering the labor force. What happens to GDP when women have moved to the labor force? Before, their work didn't count to GDP. Now they get a job, their work starts counting for GDP, right? And actually, it increases GDP by more than that, because now when the women have a child, what do? They send them to daycare, right? Which contributes to GDP. And maybe they hire a house cleaner, which contributes to GDP, right? So women entering the labor force has actually increased GDP quite significantly, because more of the work that women do is now counted in GDP. This is one reason why GDP is probably a better measure of well-being in rich countries. Why? There's less informal markets, right? And by that, I mean to say, in a country like the US, so much of what we do actually takes place in the formal market that we actually are capturing it. But if you go to poor countries, there are a lot more informal markets going on out there, right? Where people are growing, as I said, growing their own vegetables, maybe having stands on the side of the road, street vendors. That kind of stuff tends to get missed. So if you look in most poor countries, 40 to 60% of economic activity is in informal markets. So GDP might be missing 40 to 60% of what's going on in many poor countries, because so much of what goes on is informal activity. And so Sunny says, does this mean that, women entering the labor force doesn't necessarily mean that their standards of living are higher? And that's true, right? GDP is higher. It's not always clear that for every woman, life is made better off. And that's kind of the point of this, right? Is that just the fact that GDP goes up does not necessarily mean that you're better off. I saw that Zach Perry mentioned something that definitely is not included. GDP does not include black markets or the underground economy. At least in the United States, it doesn't. Economists have actually gone out and tried to measure what percent of the economy is missed by ignoring black markets and illegal activities. Anybody want to give me a guess about what this is in the US? What percent of GDP is missed because of black markets and illegal activities? Nobody wants to say.
My guess would be like 5 to 10% at least, if not higher.
That's pretty good. Bryn says 17%. Actually, Zach, your first instinct was right. About 5.5%. So not insignificant, but relatively small, particularly when you look at other countries. Anybody want to give me a guess about what it is in Italy? %, right? 35% of their GDP is in illegal activities. In fact, it's so much that Italy has begun to count drugs, the sex trade in GDP. right? They actually have begun to estimate this and include it in GDP because it is such an important part of their economy, right? Yeah, so, you know, listen, in some countries, you're missing a lot, right? If you're not incorporating Black markets and underground economy into your GDP, you're going to miss a lot, right? You're going to miss a lot. There's also a couple of other, I think, really important things that GDP doesn't get, right? One of the most important, and this is going to be a topic that we talk about a lot going forward, but GDP ignores income distribution. In the US, if we look at GDP divided by the population, in other words, GDP per capita, this is roughly about $60,000. So GDP per capita in the US is about $60,000. Does that mean that everybody in the US makes about $60,000 a year? Obviously not. And as we're going to talk about, in the United States, the top 1%, this is basically households that make more than $230,000 a year. Earn more than 50% of GDP. The top 1%, households making more than $230,000 a year, earn more than half of all income in the United States. Income is incredibly skewed in the US. And we will discuss this at much more length next week. But yeah, there is a huge amount of income disparity. And if we look at disparity in wealth, it's even bigger. So this is a huge limitation in GDP, right? Because when there's, you know, when we see that GDP goes up by 3%, we have to ask ourselves, well, does that mean everybody's incomes are going up by 3%? And unfortunately, what it's really meant the last 40 years is that those in the top 20%, the top 10%, have gotten a huge part of those gains, right? Gotten a huge part of those gains. But people in the bottom 50% have seen incomes that have remained relatively flat, right? So yeah, I mean, this is a huge reason why GDP does not always necessarily reflect welfare. Sunny asks, Professor, how's it been being part of the top 1% for the past few decades? I wish I knew. I don't know if you guys knew this, but I teach at Cornell College. So I am not in the top 1%. I'm not complaining, but yeah, no, I am not. I can't even see the top 1%. I'm sorry to say. So yeah, that's a big problem, right? That is a big problem. One final thing, and we could just keep on going on and on here with different problems with GDP, but there is one final problem that I want to kind of emphasize to you all, and that is GDP does not include externalities. Let's talk about what an externality is. Those of you who've taken micro have talked about externalities. But an externality is a cost or a benefit that impacts people other than the buyer or seller. right? So when there's a transaction and there's costs and benefits that impact people other than the buyer and seller, that is an externality. And GDP really ignores a lot of these costs. It ignores, for instance, positive externalities, meaning benefits that incur to society in general, not just to the buyer and seller. A classic example of this would be what we're doing right now, hopefully, education, right? Having a more, you having a better education benefits you, but hopefully it will also benefit the people around you, right? Because you will be a better citizen, you will help people create ideas, right? You will make more informed choices for your family and for your children. There's I think there's a lot of strong evidence that education creates a lot of positive externalities, benefits that incur to people other than just you. But those things aren't included in GDP, right? Those things are not included in GDP. On the flip side, there's a lot of negative externalities. Costs to society that aren't necessarily included. The classic example here is pollution, right? If I buy a farm and I put up a hog lot and I have my cows shit, and the shit, next time it rains, goes right into the river and flows down river, and what about all those people downriver? They are experiencing a cost to that, right? But that is a cost that is not necessarily going to be reflected to me as the producer or to the people who buy my cows or my pigs. And so that is a big negative externality. And so, all sorts of negative externalities, whether it's pollution, whether it's the impact of global warming, none of these things are directly incorporated in the GDP. And so, yes, there are a lot of criticisms that can be made of GDP, right? GDP really misses a lot of what's going on in society. So having said that, why in the world do we still use GDP if it's got so many problems? And honestly, the answer is that any measure, right? Any single measure is going to have problems, right? There is no one perfect measure of welfare. You can measure welfare in other ways. You can look at things like life expectancy. You could look at things like childhood mortality. You could look at education rates, right? There's other ways that you can measure welfare. You can even look at surveys that try to measure happiness, right? Those are all ways to try to measure welfare, but they're going to have its problems too, right? They're going to have their problems too. We can take a fair amount of comfort, though, in the fact that regardless of how we measure welfare, we find a lot of correlation between GDP and happiness and GDP and welfare, right? So in other words, countries that have higher GDP also tend to have higher life expectancy. They also tend to be more highly educated. They also, as you can see on this chart here, express a higher life satisfaction, right? So regardless of how we measure income, we tend to see that all of these measures of welfare are correlated. Measures of health, right? Countries that have higher GDP also tend to have better measures of public health. So, I guess the best analogy I can give you is that GDP is a little bit like all these little pedometers that we wear on our watches, like these smart watches that tell us, well, you need to get to your 10,000 steps, right? Well, yeah, 10,000 steps is probably good for your health, but it's not a guarantee. Likewise, having high GDP is probably a good thing for your country, but it's not a guarantee that you're going to be a well-off country. Having said that, I think there's a lot of reason to suspect that as much as any single measure, GDP does a reasonable job of capturing how well off a country is, right? Not to say that it doesn't have its problems and its limitations, it does. But it's you know, of a lot of mediocre alternatives, it's one of the best, right? And so that's the measure of income and living standards that we're going to use in this class. Okay, we're running a little bit late, so let's take a break here. This is probably a good place to take a break. We'll just take a quick break of 5 minutes. Let's meet back here at 10:10, and then we're going to talk about how we measure inflation. All right, see you in a couple. Hey, everybody. If you want to come on back. So we're going to get right back into it without too much messing around. I do have to leave a little bit before 11 o'clock today because, as I said, I've got a meeting that I cannot miss. So in case I forget to say this at the end of class, we will have class again at 12:30. Basically, I want to make sure that we finish chapter 7 because tomorrow's quiz is going to be on chapter 2 on comparative advantage and chapter 7. Okay, we're just going to make it on that material. So I want to make sure that we finish chapter 7 today. So what we'll do this afternoon is we will talk about chapter 7, finish up what we don't get through. Maybe I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about some basic things in chapter 8, depending upon time. And then I'll make sure class will end a little bit early this afternoon. We won't go all the way to 2 o'clock because I want to do want to make sure that we have some office hours so that you can talk to me about your quiz or anything else that's going on with you, okay? So that would be kind of the plan this afternoon. Once again, we will take our second quiz tomorrow afternoon, and it will be over comparative advantage, and it will be over chapter 7 on GDP and inflation, okay? That's going to be what the quiz is tomorrow. Okay, so let's jump back into it here and talk about measuring inflation. So how do we actually measure inflation? Well, if you remember, what is inflation? Inflation is the percent change in the economy-wide price level. Okay, percent change in the economy-wide price level. The key word here is this economy-wide, okay? When we talk about inflation, we're not just talking about the price of one single good. We're not talking about the price of one single good. We're talking about the price of goods across the economy. So if I can just give you an example, during break, I went up into the sunlight and I talked to my roofers, right? The roof guys are up there banging around. And they were saying they had to replace some beams in my roof. And so the cost of that last year, the cost of the wood last year would have been about $300. This year, the cost is $600, right? You might have heard about this, the big increase in lumber prices in the US. That, though, is not inflation by itself, right? That's the change in the price of a single good. When we talk about inflation, we're talking about increases in prices across the economy. So, you know, lumber prices alone going up is not inflation. It's just the change in the price of a single good. When we talk about inflation, we're really trying to measure what's happening to prices across the economy. how do we measure inflation? There are really two different measures. The first is actually closely related to GDP. What we call the aggregate price index. The aggregate price index is basically a measure of inflation using nominal GDP. It's a measure of inflation using nominal GDP. So, what is the aggregate price index? It is just nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. It's just a ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. And then to get the inflation rate, you calculate the percent change in the aggregate price index over time. So because we usually express inflation as a percent change in the price level, this measure of inflation just looks at the percent change in the aggregate price index over time. So this measure of inflation is really looking at inflation in everything that's in GDP. So first you calculate the index, which is the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. And then you calculate the inflation rate. Let's go back to our previous example. Okay. So when I say previous example, I mean that real GDP and nominal GDP example we had before. What's the aggregate price index in 2019 in Toddlandia? Right, this is the Toddlandia example. Well, what was nominal GDP? $1,700. What was real GDP? Also 1,700. So what was the aggregate price index? It was 100. Why is the index 100? Because 2019 is the base year, right? The index is always going to be 100 in the base year because nominal GDP and real GDP are going to be the same things. So in the base year, because 2019 is the base year, nominal and real GDP will always be the same things. So that makes this 100. That one's easy. What's the aggregate price index in 2020? Well, we have to take nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100 to get that index. So what was nominal GDP? 2,300. What was real GDP? 1,400. So 2,300 divided by 1,400. The aggregate price index in 2020 was 164. So what does that mean? Does that mean that inflation was 164%? No, right? Because that's only the first step. To get the inflation rate between 2019 and 2020, we have to take the percent change and the aggregate price index. So we have to take our new observation of 164 minus the old, divided by the old, multiplied by 100. And we get 64%, right? Once again, remember here, it's always the new minus the old, and we always divide by the old because we always are interested in where we came from. We want to express our growth rates relative to where we came from, meaning the oldest observation. So inflation is 64% according to the aggregate price index. Okay, that is one measure of inflation, right? That is one measure of inflation to basically use real and nominal GDP as the way to measure our inflation rate, right? And that's what we call the aggregate price aggregate price index. Sometimes economists call this a broad measure of inflation. And what do we mean by a broad measure? This is including a lot of goods, right? This is including everything in GDP. So yeah, there's a lot in here, right? There's a lot in this. It's a very broad measure of GDP. However, there's also a problem with this measure of GDP, and that problem is what's included in here? A lot, including things like the cost of aircraft carriers, the costs of welding materials, the costs of computer equipment, right? I mean, this is including everything in GDP. It is so broad that, you know, I think many people are interested in, well, I'm not really so much interested in what's happening to the price of aircraft carriers. I'm more interested in what's happening to the price of the consumer goods that I buy. And so that's the purpose of this second measure of inflation, the consumer price index. The CPI. This is the more, I would say, the more commonly used measure of inflation, usually in newspapers, or on the internet. When you see people refer to inflation, they more commonly use the consumer price index. Why? Because the focus of the consumer price index is more on what we could think of as the cost of living, consumer goods. Its focus is on consumer goods. So let's talk about how the consumer price index works. But in many ways, it actually, as we're going to see, is not dramatically different from the aggregate price index, right? Right? So how do we calculate this? Well, the first thing that the government does when they calculate this is they fix the basket. And basically, what this means is they estimate what a typical family consumes each month. So the government estimates, you know, how many gallons of milk does a typical consumer or typical family drink every month? How many gallons of gasoline? How much do they spend on streaming services? How much do they spend on rent on their house? How much do they spend on daycare, right? I mean, it goes on and on and on. If I can show you here, just a little pie chart, this gives you some rough idea of what a typical family spends every month and what kind of things they're buying. So you notice here, housing is a big part, right? Housing is about 40% of what a typical household spends. Medical care is also a very big, and then food and beverages, right? And then, you know, outside of that, there's transportation costs, education, recreation, motor fuel, apparel, other goods and services. So there, listen, the Consumer Price Index focuses on consumer goods, but there's still a lot of different things included in this, right? It's not just one or two things. A lot of different things are included in Consumer Price Index. But once again, the focus here is on consumer goods, right? Consumer goods. One of the things that I want us to understand, though, is in this Consumer Price Index, we kind of put all of these things together into a basket. But it is important to notice that not all of these things see the same kind of inflation over time. And if you can see this graph, this gives you an example of this. Unfortunately for you, what's the part of this, of a consumer spending that's gone up the most over time? Higher education. Inflation in higher education is much higher than it is in healthcare, which is much higher than it is in food services, which is much higher in clothing and household durables. In fact, if you look at this, there's been almost no inflation in clothing and household durables over the last 40 years, almost no inflation. But where there is inflation, significant inflation, is in services, healthcare, and of course, higher education, right? And I guess we don't right now want to get into the reason why this is the case. There's a lot of things that are going into this, quite honestly, as to why education is going up so much faster than other things. Partly, once again, I don't want to get into this too much, but partly this is, as you can see on this graph, what's known as Baumol's cost disease. And what does that mean? It basically means that there are some goods that are very normal goods, right? We talked about what a normal good is, that when your income goes up, you want to buy more of it. Well, some goods are extremely normal, meaning that when your income goes up, you want to buy a lot more of it. And what are two examples of goods that are very normal? Healthcare and education, right? People, even with a little bit more money, would like to get more education, and they would like to live. And so that is part of what's driving up inflation, is just, you know, a relatively high demand for these things. I think there's other things that are going on too. There's definitely other things that are going on, but that is one of the things that's going on here. Okay, so that's the basket, right? Once you get the basket, oh, it didn't work. So once you get the basket, the next step is you want to find the prices of all these goods, right? So you want to find the prices of all that orange juice, all that gasoline, right? Find prices for rent and other measures of housing. Once you find the prices, then you can calculate the Consumer Price Index. And what is the Consumer Price Index? It's the price of everything in that basket in the current year, prices, divided by the price of the basket in base year prices. And then you multiply that by 100. Hopefully you can read my writing there. So it's the price of the basket in current prices divided by the price of the basket in base year prices. And you multiply this by 100. Does this at all look familiar to you? This is a lot like the aggregate price index, right? The difference is the aggregate price index has nominal GDP, meaning GDP in current prices. And then the denominator is real GDP or GDP in base year prices. So this is really the same idea as the aggregate price index. The main difference is we're just looking at a different set of goods, right? We're looking at a different set of goods. And then the final the final part is then we calculate inflation, where we take the percentage change in the CPI. You calculate the percent change in the CPI. So this afternoon, I want to come back and work through an example of this. Okay, so we'll actually work through an example of doing the consumer price index this afternoon as a way to kind of practice doing that, right? Practice doing that. Maybe actually if we have a little bit of time this morning, we'll do that. But I do want to make sure that we finish up a little bit before 11. But we'll come back and work through an example so that we understand that. So let's kind of back up here and talk about what are the differences between the aggregate price index and the consumer price index. Just to make sure that we understand what the differences between these are. What are the differences between the aggregate price index and the consumer price index? Some of them are pretty obvious, but then there's some that are not so obvious. So let's start out with the obvious one. What's the obvious difference between the aggregate price index and the consumer price index?
The set of goods that they're using.
The set of goods, right? The CPI focuses on consumer goods, while the aggregate price index focuses on GDP, right? Everything in GDP. That's obviously one of the big differences. Okay. Now, here's another difference, and this one may not be, is not going to be as obvious until I think when you hear it, you'll say, oh, that makes sense. But one of the interesting things is the consumer price index includes imports, while the aggregate price index, can't write. Includes exports, right? So the consumer price index includes no exports, but it does include imports. So for instance, running shoes, right, or tennis shoes. Most tennis shoes are made in other countries. The price of those tennis shoes actually get included in the consumer price index, even though they're not made in the US. Or big screen TVs, or any of the other things that are largely made in other countries. Those things get included in CPI, right? But the CPI is not including any exports. On the opposite side, the aggregate price level includes exports, but it does not include any imports, right? And so this can lead to a difference between the two, right? Is that, you know, they really are looking at a different set of goods. Now, there's a third difference, and I'm going to put a star next to this one because this one is a trickier one, right? Or one that's a little bit more subtle, but as a practical matter has a lot of big implications for how you understand it. The aggregate price index The aggregate price index has quantities that constantly change. While the consumer price index uses a fixed basket of goods. Does the consumer price index change this basket? Yes, but they only do it every decade or so. They do not update this every month. So the basket of goods is really fixed from month to month and from year to year. Now, why is that important? The reason why this is important is because this actually introduces a bias in the consumer price index. The fact that the basket is fixed introduces a bias in the consumer price index. Right? In fact, maybe I shouldn't say it introduces a bias, it introduces biases because it introduces multiple biases in the consumer price index. But let's talk about this. The first is what we could call a substitution bias. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. I think I just told you that the guys who are doing my roof, and you can validate this if you go online. What was I reading the other day? That relative to this time last year, the average cost of building a house has gone up by $30,000, right? Simply because of increases in lumber prices, right? Well, lumber's not a good example because lumber's probably not included in the consumer price index. So let me change my example. Let's say that orange juice goes up by a similar amount. Orange juice prices jump by 100%. What does the consumer price index assume? That people keep on buying the same amount of orange juice. But in reality, what are people going to do? Yeah, I can read your lips, Krista. They're going to buy something else, right? They're going to buy orange juice or Kool-Aid or Pepsi, right? And so in that sense, is the increase in inflation really impacting people as much as the consumer price index says it is? No, because they switched to something else, right? So this substitution bias, it really comes from the fact that the CPI does not let people substitute. It does not let people substitute cheaper goods for more expensive goods. As a result, it tends to overstate inflation. The consumer price index tends to overstate inflation. Because people figure out a way to avoid higher prices. But the consumer price index doesn't really take that into account. It doesn't really take that into account. And so that's a bias. The consumer price index tends to overstate inflation. Here's another bias. Unmeasured changes in quality. So, just this morning, while I was eating breakfast, I learned on the box of my cereal that my Raisin Bran has 2 bigger scoops of raisin in it, right? I mean, it's a pretty big change in my life, right? There's more raisins in my Raisin Bran. Now, what happens if the company says, yes, consumers deserve more raisins in their Raisin Bran, and as a result, we're just going to charge a little bit higher price? Is that really inflation? No, I mean, in some sense, you're selling a better good, right? The price has gone up because the quality has gone up. But is the government necessarily going to capture that? No, they're just going to assume that when the price goes up, it's because of inflation. So sometimes prices rise because of better goods. But our data doesn't capture this. As a result, once again, we tend to overstate inflation. This is a big problem in the computer industry, quite honestly, because you think about computing power is changing so quickly that the government actually has a very difficult time in trying to figure out, try to measure changes in quality and adjust the price statistics for that. It's actually, without getting into the detail, it's a pretty complicated issue. And so, yeah, because we have a difficult time measuring this, we tend to, a lot of changes in quality tend to get counted as inflation. Many new goods are often missed. Many new goods are often not included in the consumer price index because that basket doesn't adjust very quickly. I was just reading just this morning, because I was kind of curious in this question. The consumer price index still assumes that people are going to as many movies as we did in 2012. How many movies have you been to in the last year? Right? No, we're not going to movies, we're streaming, right? And I suspect that when COVID is over, we're not going to go see as many movies as we did before, right? So, these new goods are often new goods because they're cheaper. Right? One of the reasons why streaming is so attractive is because it's cheaper than going to a movie. But once again, we're missing many of these new goods. And so, not to keep on repeating myself, I'll just draw an arrow. Once again, we're tending to overstate inflation because we're not paying attention to the ways that new goods are cheaper. And then finally, I'll just say that one of the things that the government has really had a hard time keeping track of is new outlets for people buying things, right? For things like online shopping. So I needed some new running shoes yesterday. I know exactly the brand I wanted. So I went into Google Shopping and typed in the brand. How many different prices did I see? 100 different prices for the same kind of shoe, right? Which price am I supposed to use if I'm the government calculating CPI data? Who knows? Right? I mean, that's a real challenging question. Traditionally, the government has tended to focus on in-person shopping. For instance, they've tended to get a lot of prices from places like Target and Walmart and malls. But one of the things we know is that this type of shopping, particularly today, nowadays, is more expensive. You can usually get things cheaper online. Once again, just to repeat, that's tending to overstate inflation. It's tending to overstate inflation. Okay. Now, why am I making such a big deal about this? Well, because it is a big deal. From an economist's point of view, it's a big deal because it biases our data, right? Our data has mistakes in it because we know that we're not always accurately measuring the true effects of inflation. And so that's troublesome for economists, right? Is we want our data to be as accurate as possible. And so the fact that we know that this is a problem with the way that we measure data creates problems. We want to have real data. But this is dependent on having good inflation data.
I have a question about the inflation and stuff. So is there something in the inflation that would take into consideration like the printing of money or additional input by the government into the economy?
So Zach, you're getting into the causes of inflation, and we're going to stay away from that today. Okay, we're only going to talk today about how we measure inflation. Tomorrow, actually, we're going to begin to talk about the causes of inflation, right? And actually, probably more in next week. So I'm gonna put you off for a little bit on that question, but we will definitely come around to it about what causes inflation. Here's another reason why this is a big deal. Many people have wages that are indexed to inflation. What does indexed mean? That it adjusts automatically as inflation data changes. I don't know if any of your parents work in a union, but traditionally union wages have what are called cost of living adjustments to them. Cost of living adjustments, or sometimes these are called COLAs, right? A cost of living adjustment basically says that your wage automatically changes as inflation changes. So you'll sign a contract, a 5-year contract that says this is your wage, but your wage goes up. Your wage is indexed to the consumer price index. So if the consumer price index goes up by 1%, your wage goes up by 1%. What's the idea here? The idea here is to keep real wages constant, meaning adjusted for inflation, the real wage stays constant. So you have to change your nominal wage by the amount of inflation. That's the idea. But what happens if you're not what happens if you're not measuring inflation correctly? Well, then you may not be adjusting your wages correctly, right? This leads to biases in wage adjustments, right? If your inflation data is going to be biased, then that means that your cost of living adjustments are going to be biased. And so this can actually mean that wages get changed in ways that aren't consistent with the actual cost of living. The same is true for government programs. Many government programs are also indexed to the consumer price index, such as Social Security. Okay, so for Social Security, it is indexed to the consumer price index. So if the consumer price index goes up by 2%, what happens to your grandma's Social Security check? It goes up by 2%, right? And that's the law, right? The law is that whatever consumer price index is, your grandma's Social Security check goes up by that amount. Now, let's think about that. If consumer price index is overstating inflation, who is that good for? Who tends to benefit from that? If the consumer price index is saying inflation is higher than it actually is, then who does that tend to benefit? What do you think, Nevaeh? You think that benefits somebody?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I was like cutting out on my end.
Yeah, sure. So if the consumer price index overstates inflation, and if your grandma's check goes up by the amount of the consumer price index, who does that tend to benefit?
Oh, my grandma.
It benefits your grandma, right? Well, who doesn't love their grandma? That's great for grandma. But the problem is, who does that cost?
It can end up costing like us, like people who like pay like taxes and like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Taxpayers, right? This costs the government and taxpayers an estimated $10 billion a year by at least one estimate. That is a lot of money. That is a lot of money. It's a good deal for grandma. We're happy for grandma, but it costs taxpayers quite a bit. Why don't we change this? Economists know that the consumer price index has problems, so why don't we just adjust the consumer price index so that we adjust people's Social Security checks a little bit more accurately? Who's going to throw a fit? Grandma, right? This is another example of special interest politics. So, you know, the AARP will go ballistic, right? All the grandmas will go ballistic over this. What do we know about old people? They tend to vote, right? So the people that benefit from this bias vote. And so that's why there's very little chance that this is going to get changed. Who's hurt by this? Well, taxpayers, meaning me and someday you. Why don't they count in this process? Well, part of why they don't count in this process is because people that are your age largely don't, well, I shouldn't say largely, but they don't vote, not nearly enough, right? And so this is, once again, just one of these political things, right? Special interest politics, where, you know, to a large extent, people who are elderly have a bigger say about this because, you know, they lose a lot, or they stand to gain a lot by this. And so they have a lot to invest to make sure that this program doesn't change. And so this is just, you know, I guess I'm spending a lot of time talking about this, but this is in part because I really want us to understand that the data that we use in economics matters. It has a lot of practical significance, not only in terms of us understanding the economy, but it influences the decisions we make, but it has real consequences like the size of our budget, right? You know, this data matters, right? And our accuracy of our data matters, and we need to understand all of these biases. Before I let you go, and I really do have to run here, I'm just going to show you really quickly. You can see in this graph how the consumer price index and the consumer price index behave over time. And actually, I didn't describe this other measure of inflation here, which is the PPI, or the producer price index. The producer price index is exactly the same as the consumer price index, except it focuses on producer goods. It tends to focus on things like raw materials. So if you look here, the producer price index is very volatile. It goes up and down a lot because inputs tend to be raw materials tend to have big price fluctuations. But you can also see the GDP deflator in the consumer price index. In general, the consumer price index measures inflation higher than the GDP deflator. GDP deflator here is another word for the aggregate price index, right? The aggregate price index. So as we've talked about, consumer price index tends to measure inflation a little high. And that creates some biases in our statistics. Why don't we just use the aggregate price index? Because that's got problems too, right? That's using a whole bunch of goods that may not reflect the cost of living. And so, you know, this returns us to one of the big themes for class this morning, right? Is that all data has biases, and we have to understand these biases if we're going to properly interpret data, right? There is no one perfect data point, right? There is no one perfect set of data that's going to explain everything to you about the economy. So, you know, we kind of have to take this data, but we also have to make sure that we adjust it based on our understanding of what's really being captured by this data. Okay, I'm going to let it go there and kind of jump out of here so I can get to my meeting. So we'll all be back here at 12:30, right? I do want to do a couple of problems from doing the GDP deflator and the consumer price index. We'll kind of do a little bit of that. And then, like I said, I want to kind of keep class short this afternoon. It's the middle of the week where we're all getting tired. So we'll kind of keep a relatively short class. And I'll have time after class if any of you want to talk about your quiz or just anything that you would like to talk to in class, okay? All right, thank you, everybody. We'll see you in a little bit.